So this next section is about the different historical interpretations of the Cold War. So now is a good time to talk about changing perspectives and the fact that historians often argue a lot about different interpretations of events and everything like that. So, and then also since the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the USSR in 1991, historians have been able to access a wealth of Soviet archive materials. And these had previously been unavailable or only available in parts or censored. So, after that, as the years have passed, you had access to the Soviet perspective. Also, U.S. government documents have been made public, and many of the key players throughout it have published memoirs and diaries. All of this has allowed historians to cross-check and either corroborate or dismiss early interpretations of the Cold War, especially significant moments and key factors. One example is how close did we come to nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis? And for a long time, it was thought we came real close, real close. And now it's not so close. It turns out that the Soviets really did not want to use a nuclear weapon. So, different awareness changes over time. This topic is also, fundamentally full of political aspects and attitudes. And that is, especially ideological battles between communism and capitalism. So it should not be surprising, therefore, that there are several almost diametrically opposed explanations for the origins and the development of the Cold War. Historians, like most people, are rarely completely neutral when dealing with important or controversial issues. For this reason, you should be aware, where relevant, of the political sympathies and even the ideological agendas of historians and politicians writing about the Cold War. As you begin to study it, you will come across words like orthodox historian, or revisionist, or post-revisionist, or even post-revisionist perspectives. And then there's traditionalist and modernist, and you're going to find a lot of those. So just keep in mind that as we continue our studies. So do you like my little bit emoji staring at the couch, wishing I could lay down, but actually I am laying down while teaching, so this is pretty awesome anyways. But I did want to say, before we start, on some of the origins of the Cold War and looking at the different historical interpretation, that anytime you're dealing with the origins and the development of the Cold War, you almost have to look at the most significant features of its nature. Most historians consider the Cold War ended in either 1989 or 1991. So for most of you, all of you actually, this ended before you were born. Some political commentators and historians saw the Cold War like a massive chess game or a game of Go, with major implications not just for those playing the game, but also for the rest of the world. Some people even believe the Cold War would lead to the destruction of the entire world. Certainly there were occasions on which the nuclear weapons were deployed during the various crises that marked the different stages of the Cold War. Outlining the main aspects of the nature of the Cold War is not straightforward, especially as historians do not always use the term in the same way. However, something most historians do agree on is that for much of the time, the Cold War presented itself as a regional and global contest between two rival states and their respective allies, the USA and the West, and the USSR and the East. How this rivalry varied over time the broader effects it had on different aspects of the 20th century and history will be examined throughout the rest of this semester. So after the Second World War ended, a Cold War developed between what became known as the East and the West. This Cold War is considered to have ended at the latest in 1991. Historians, however, disagree over exactly when it started and the dates of the different phases. Historians also disagree over the essential nature of the Cold War, so there are many different explanations for the same phenomenon. Parts of the Cold War involved a contest between two superpowers, the USA and the USSR. However, not all historians see this as a contest between equals. There were many aspects to the Cold War, including a propaganda war based on the different ideologies of the two superpowers. And the Cold War affected many aspects of politics and society in the countries involved, particularly the operation of the United Nations. Other features of the Cold War included an arms race, cultural, scientific, and sporting competition, spying and covert activities, and public fears about a Third World War. So, as we've already covered, historians do disagree over the origins and the phases of the Cold War, and they also differ in their interpretation of the conflict's time scale and chronological order of the different phases, not only from when it began, but also when it ended. Some argue that it ended in 1989 with the collapse of the Eastern European states, and then others argue that it wasn't until 1991 when the USSR itself collapsed. Most historians, though, do agree on a few aspects of the Cold War. They accept that there was a first Cold War, which began sometime after the end of the Second World War, and which ended at some point in the 1950s. Debate continues over whether a further one or two periods of the Cold War followed. The important thing here is that you understand that it was a continuous underlining of rivalry and mistrust between two different economic and social systems since 1943, or some could even argue since 1917. And most agree that there was a thaw or a détente during that period as well. Most historians believe that both sides ultimately agreed they could not coexist, and so their ultimate goal was to weaken each other by any means short of all-out war, including the establishment, training, and arming of terrorist groups in different developing parts of the world. As part of this cold conflict, both sides suppressed or sought to control their internal dissidents, or as they were termed, the enemy within, and were often prepared to ally themselves with regimes and movements that conflicted strongly with their stated political ideology or beliefs. Most historians agree that this was a conventional and especially a nuclear weapons buildup and arms race, that intense propaganda was used in order to suppress accurate or balanced information in both states. In particular, the West tried to depict the USSR as a totalitarian equivalent of Nazi Germany, while the USSR painted capitalism as an inherently warmongering system. No common ground or successful negotiations happened, and a deep division between the two camps arose. There was this built-in, ingrained conflict between capitalism and communism, which often spilled over into developing countries and created an atmosphere of intense fear. As a result, governments on both sides tightened the controls and the repression of dissidents within their own country, and the East and West conflict was paramount. These are the phases of the Cold War, and again, as I've stated before, historians do tend to disagree over even something as small as 1 to 2 year difference. What I do want to note is number 5, détente, which pretty much started in about 1969. We can almost date that with the intense protest movements that rose up to and ended in about 1979, which honestly was basically because Ronald Reagan was elected president. During this period, there were 7 main features of the Cold War. First, there was a retreat from an all-out arms race. Second, there was repeated public calls for peace. Third, there was a pursuit of an agreed levels of armament, meaning although there was no major disarmament, they agreed to stop making weapons for a time. 4, there was a greater tolerance of each other's social order and more interest in accurate information about its character. 5, there was agreements on the developing world in Europe, achieved by a series of summits and long-running conferences and visits by head of state. These visits were called shuttle diplomacy, where different heads of states for the first time were going, flying here and flying there, and rather than all having to meet in one city and it taking time. There was attempts by the West in particular to get itself out of the developing world and the confrontations that had been rising up to this period. And there was an attempt to draw a line in the face of the revolutionary forces it had been combating. And lastly, there was looser immigration controls in the Eastern Bloc in the early 1970s, following a kind of internal thaw that started in Russia following the death of Stalin. So overall, during such periods as détente, there were attempts by both sides to separate the various international tensions that periodically had been rising up. Yet, by 1979, that thaw was over, and you get the second major stage of the Cold War, which we called the Second Cold War. So historians have developed at least 3 major interpretations concerning the reasons for the Cold War. Not surprisingly, though, there were multiple, often conflicting assessments of its nature. The 3 major theories and 5 other theories will follow. The Russian menace. This theory, of course, is probably most closely identified as the traditional theory of the reason or the cause of the Cold War. It certainly appeared probably around 1945 and was definitely popular throughout the 1950s. Many saw this as, this was Russia's fault. This was a series of crises and conflicts resulting from Russian expansionism and Soviet communism, with the West running this free, everybody free, the West and freedom from the struggles of communism. And this came right out of the idea of containment. Hence, the actions taken by the U.S. and its allies were merely defensive measures against the threat of Soviet tyranny. This is a very simplistic cause for it, and of course places all the blame on the East. So some historians have gone to the opposite side and blamed the U.S. This is U.S. imperialism, that essentially the United States is a military industrial complex, which refers to the top U.S. military leaders in the Pentagon and large industries like Boeing and companies that have ran the U.S. and in terms are trying to spread a global economic hegemony. So this is the opposite viewpoint of the Russian menace. Instead of Moscow being the heart of an evil empire, the threat actually came from Washington. And it states capitalism as being predatory, oh, children, and expansionist, and that essentially U.S. capitalism was trying to take over the world, and that they would use invasion, the backing of coups, the backing leaders who were loyal to the United States regardless of their ideology. and that they would even go so far as to train and arm terrorists. In fact, such actions have been seen as essential to the United States, which is said to need enemies in war in order to maintain their high profitability within our capitalist system. So this is actually, quite the other extreme. So our third theory on the origins is the West-West conflict theory. And this states that the Cold War is far more complex than the first two theories allow for, suggesting that it was simply a smokescreen for the United States to take over Western Europe and Japan and areas of Asia. In this theory, the U.S. places the Soviet Union in a role as the evil empire, but in reality, the United States was willing to do anything to achieve its objectives. Arguably, this can be seen most notably during the Second Cold War, a period that coincided with Western economic problems and also the rise of independent nationalist movements throughout the developing world. According to this view, the events of the Cold War were simply an extension of this inevitable competition and conflict between rich capitalist states and poor developing ones. This theory, the intrastate theory, is closely related to the West-West conflict theory, and it suggests that the Cold War was essentially the playing out on an international stage of developments in the internal economy and social formations of the most important individual states. As such, the foreign policies of the USA and the USSR during the Cold War should be seen as attempts by politicians, and in the case of capitalist states, of groups of companies to use these international events as opportunities to resolve internal tensions and overcome competitors. Again, our next theory is closely related to the two previous theories, and this is the class conflict theory, although this is much more related to Marxism than the previous two. Basically, here we see that the tensions between the superpowers resulted in this historic conflict between capitalism and communism. Adherents to this theory see the Cold War as both the result of these tensions and a cover or excuse to intervene militarily in areas considered important. Such U.S. interventions during the Cold War could be sold to the general public in the West as merely defensive responses to deliberate attempts by Moscow to spread its evil empire and ideology, even when evidence suggested the USSR had played no role in them. So basically the idea is, let's create this conflict, this fear within our own society in order to then move about and intervene in areas that economically help our own country. Both sides did this. This is one of the larger theories on the origins of the Cold War, and essentially it sees the Cold War as an attempt by the two superpowers not to vanquish each other, but to carve up the rest of the world. This theory rose up in the 1960s, was popular with a lot of professors who were teaching and writing about the Cold War then. It was also associated in particular with Mao and Communist China and their supporters of Marxism and Leninism. So essentially it says that this was not a dispute between these two, and rather this was a way of these two superpowers to keep everybody else in check. Certainly we see the Cold War change by the 1960s because now you have Communist China enter, and it goes from being a bipolar conflict to now a multipolar conflict. However, one argues about to what extent was both the U.S. and the USSR global superpowers. Certainly during the Second World War, the term Superpower was first used to describe the three major powers in the Grand Alliance: the United States, the USSR, and Great Britain. But in reality, the USA, or the US, was the only country that came out of the war with a strong economy. So it's quite debatable whether both the USSR and the US were global powers. The US economy had grown tremendously, and by 1945, it had a greater productive capacity than all other states combined. Also for Russia, Russia was invaded by Hitler. And so by 1945, it's almost as if Russia has to begin again. Certainly, one can date more of a superpower theory post-1949 when you have an equalizing event happen and USSR gets nuclear weapons. But up until then, it had only been the US with a strong economy and the capacity for creating more nuclear weapons. Some historians argue that essentially the Cold War was driven by a new factor that emerged only in 1945, and that is nuclear weapons. They take the view that the Cold War was dominated by attempts by both superpowers to stop and even reverse the arms race as an issue of paramount importance to the survival of the human race. At times, the logic of nuclear defense seemed beyond the control of political leaders, and both sides carried different degrees of responsibility for escalating the nuclear arms race at different times. The last major theory put forward by historians focuses on what for many years was called the Third World, or developing countries. This theory suggests that the history after 1945 was mainly a series of conflicts between powerful states like the US and the USSR to fight for control of weaker countries, which were of economic or strategic importance to them, or as a way of weakening their superpower rival. This issue was complicated by local political movements in the Third World, which were intent on taking control for themselves. These groups were often prepared to oppose superpowers or to use them for their own ends.